Breaking tonight, the geopolitical map of the Pacific just shattered. Japan didn't elect a politician. They chose a force of nature. Tremors are spreading across Asia tonight. Japan held a general election, but instead of the usual shuffling of party factions and backroom compromises, an earthquake struck, and its name is Sanae Takaichi. Everyone believed Japan was locked in permanent stagnation. Wall Street had written off Tokyo as a fading power. Beijing assumed Japan would continue wobbling, waffling, hedging forever. Analysts predicted another fragile coalition, another weak mandate, another decade of drift. They were all utterly wrong. Tokyo, February 8, 2026. Japan's first female prime minister stands before a nation stunned by its own decision. Sanae Takaichi didn't just win an election, she won more seats than any prime minister in Japan since World War II, in both proportional terms and absolute numbers. She now commands a so-called supermajority, 2/3 of Japan's lower house. Enough power to overrule the upper chamber. Enough power to rewrite Japan's pacifist constitution if she so chooses. Enough power to do almost anything she decides Japan needs. Translation: Japan just handed one person a mandate unlike any seen in the post-war era, and the world is only beginning to understand what that means. And what happened next? The nation that spent 3 decades frozen in stagnation just handed the keys to a motorbike-riding, heavy metal drummer who names Margaret Thatcher as her inspiration and reveals exactly why Asia's balance of power will never look the same again. Dear viewers, between November 2025 and February 2026, something extraordinary happened in Japanese politics. A nation desperate for hope stopped waiting. Prices rose. Wages didn't. Rice became expensive. Young people saw no bright future. And into that vacuum walked Sanae Takaichi, outspoken, relentless, fiercely nationalist, and told Japan something it hadn't heard in a generation: we are still a great power. The pattern was identical across every polling district. Ordinary Japanese voters would reference the stagnation of the past 30 years, express frustration with weak leadership, and ask if someone could fight for them. Takaichi's answer was always the same: yes, and I won't apologize for it. This isn't just about one election. This is about the fundamental collapse of Japan's culture of political timidity and the rise of something new, something that Canberra, Washington, and Beijing are all scrambling to assess right now. Let's be precise about what happened here, because precision matters when the stakes are this high. Japan is the world's 4th largest economy. Its defense spending already sits inside the global top 5. By some projections, it will surpass Britain's military budget to become the #1 defense spender among all U.S. allies. Think about that for a moment. America's closest ally in Asia, the country that spent decades constitutionally forbidden from offensive military operations, is now spending more on defense than the United Kingdom. And Takaichi isn't stopping there. She has promised to revive Japan's economy and build a military that matches its economic weight. This is not gradual reform. This is transformation. Yoichi Kato, a scholar at Waseda University's Institute of Asia-Pacific Studies and former political correspondent for the Asahi Shimbun, calls it bluntly: this enormous victory is a reflection of her personal popularity, not necessarily support for the Liberal Democratic Party. Translation: Japan didn't just vote for a party. Japan voted for a person, and that person believes Japan is not a middle power. She believes Japan is a great power. She intends to prove it. Now here is where the story gets genuinely dangerous for Beijing. In November 2025, Takaichi stood before Japan's parliament and said something no Japanese prime minister had ever said before, not with this clarity, not with this directness. She declared that any Chinese attack on Taiwan could pose an existential crisis for Japan and could therefore trigger Japan's legal right to take military action in collective self-defense. The room went silent. Then Beijing erupted. China excoriated her, imposed punitive trade sanctions on Japan, expected her to retreat, expected the familiar pattern of Japanese leaders going quiet, softening their language, finding a diplomatic off-ramp that saved face for everyone. She didn't move an inch. Her approval rating, already high, climbed higher. The more Beijing pushed, the more popular she became. Mike Green of the U.S. Studies Center at Sydney University, who has known Takaichi since the 1980s, puts it precisely: she won, in part, because China tried to destroy her. Translation: Beijing handed Takaichi her mandate. Every threat, every sanction, every diplomatic condemnation was political fuel she fed into her campaign. And now she sits in the prime ministership with a supermajority, a personal mandate, and a score to settle with Xi Jinping. This is not a woman who plans to kowtow. She has said so explicitly: she will confront, she will hold her ground. She plans to make Japan indispensable, not just to the region, but to the United States itself. And this is where Australia enters the frame. Mike Green didn't mince words. He said Takaichi's entrenchment in power is a very, very big deal for Australia. Not a big deal, a very, very big deal. Let that repetition sink in. Why? Because Australia is currently navigating one of the most complex strategic environments in its modern history. The AUKUS submarine partnership locks Canberra into Washington's long-term Pacific architecture. Trade tensions with Beijing continue to reshape the Indo-Pacific economic order. And Australia's own identity, middle power, U.S. ally, Indo-Pacific resident, is under constant pressure from every direction. Into this environment enters Japan's most powerful prime minister in post-war history, and she does not think like a middle power. She thinks like a great power. She thinks like an ally who intends to lead, not follow. Green offers a critical distinction. Australia's Prime Minister Albanese aligned himself with Canadian PM Mark Carney's tone, cautious, measured, hedging against the unpredictability of Washington. But Green says this explicitly that won't be Takaichi's tone. While Carney talks about decoupling from the U.S., about building alternative arrangements, about strategic distance, Takaichi takes the opposite position. She is sprinting toward Washington, making Japan essential, deepening the alliance to the point where the U.S. cannot afford to look away from the Pacific. Her response to Donald Trump's congratulations was not cautious. It was unambiguous. She wrote publicly, "The potential of our alliance is limitless." Translation: Japan just chose maximum commitment over strategic hedging, and Australia now has to decide what that means for its own positioning. Green predicts something specific that Canberra should hear very carefully. He believes Takaichi will encourage Australia to push Trump to get his act together on trade policy, economic security, and engagement with Southeast Asia. Read that again. Japan's new prime minister, armed with the largest parliamentary mandate since World War II, intends to coordinate with Australia to shape American behavior in the Indo-Pacific, not just respond to Washington. Shape it. This is a different kind of alliance politics. This is Japan saying we have leverage, we have commitment, we have willingness to lead, and we're inviting our partners to join us at the front of the queue, not the back. For Australia, this is a strategic opportunity of historic proportions. The question is whether Canberra has the vision to seize it. But let's not pretend this story is without risk, because it isn't. Kato, someone who has watched Japanese politics for decades, is not entirely celebratory. He describes the popular excitement around Takaichi as shallow, emotional, lacking a clear reasoning foundation. He notes that Japanese people voted for hope, not for specific policies. They voted for the feeling of strength, not the details of how that strength would be deployed. She can now claim carte blanche, says Kato. People will find out eventually what they've entrusted her with. It could amount to a historical achievement. It could also be devastating. This is the earthquake metaphor made real. An earthquake rearranges the landscape. Sometimes that creates opportunity, new foundations, new configurations, new possibilities. Sometimes it creates devastation. The difference lies almost entirely in the decisions made in the immediate aftermath when the ground is still shifting and every choice carries maximum consequence. Takaichi herself signaled this during the campaign. She told the Japanese people repeatedly that securing an election mandate is essential precisely because she intends to pursue bold, polarizing reforms, decisions that people might not like, policies that will cause friction, changes that will hurt before they heal. She wasn't hiding. She was warning. Here is what every observer of the Indo-Pacific needs to understand tonight. For 30 years, Japan was the great power that forgot it was a great power. Stagnation in the economy, drift in the politics, wobble on every hard question from Taiwan to military spending to constitutional reform. A country frozen at the edge of transformation, unable to step through the door. That era is over. Sanae Takaichi, motorbike rider, heavy metal drummer, self-described Iron Lady, has walked through the door, and she has taken Japan with her. The pacifist constitution may be rewritten. Defense spending will rise. The Taiwan Declaration was not a slip, it was a preview. Beijing will not get the deference it expected. Washington will get an ally that demands to be treated as a partner, not a dependent. And Australia, quietly watching from the south, managing its own strategic calculations, its own alliances, its own vulnerabilities, now shares the Pacific with a Japan that has rediscovered its ambition. Mike Green called it correctly. This is a very, very big deal for Australia. The only remaining question is whether Canberra is ready to respond with the same clarity and strategic boldness that Tokyo just displayed. If you want to understand the forces reshaping the Indo-Pacific, not the headlines, but the architecture underneath them, make sure you subscribe and stay with us. The earthquake has struck. The aftershocks are just beginning.